Death to Israel was tweeted nearly daily music on June 21st. The sky over Iran broke open. American fighter jets dropped their payloads on Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, three of Iran's most sensitive nuclear sites, in the stillness before dawn. When most of the world was asleep, the headlines by dawn proclaimed what the insiders had feared. The United States had been involved in the war for weeks. The Israeli war against Iran was no longer just. The repercussions of any full-scale escalation would extend well beyond the Middle East. The whole world economy, including international trade, oil, shipping, supply chains, diplomacy, and alliances, had just been upended. There was no warning. Shot here, this was planned and executed precise warfare. Hours later, U.S. President Donald Trump stands in front of cameras. Many thanks. The three main Iranian nuclear sites were the target of huge precision strikes by the U.S. military a short while ago. The targets for Natanz and Esfahan were determined to be completely and thoroughly destroyed. He presented the strikes as a reaffirmation of American dominance, a defense of Western security, and a setback to Iranian nuclear aspirations. However, the atmosphere in commercial hubs from Rotterdam to Singapore was everything from victorious, because there was a scary question concealed behind the blazing words and luminous missile trails. Had the most important commerce routes in the globe just been forced to the brink? Please hit the like button before we proceed to show your support and help us defeat the YouTube algorithm. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow strategic waterway that runs between Iran and Oman, is at the heart of this conflict. It is the worldwide oil jugular vein. Millions of barrels of crude oil flow through this corridor every day between 17 and 19. Almost 1/4 of all oil on Earth comes from the water. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iraq all rely on this route to access global markets, making it more than simply Iran's lifeline. The country in charge of its northern shore is now threatening to close it. Iran's reaction to U.S. airstrikes has been ferocious and well thought out. Iranian naval leaders stated that they would consider the Strait of Hormuz to be a battlefield in the event of additional attacks. Commercial tankers were shadowed by military warships. The Persian Gulf experienced a rise in GPS jamming. Additionally, shipping corporations went into crisis mode behind the scenes. Some tankers completely turned their backs on Hormuz. Others started to avoid Iranian waters by hugging the Omani shoreline. Shipping risk ratings were increased 1. At a time, London-based Lloyd's increased war risk premiums, and supertanker profits soared. Costs increased for each barrel that was delayed or routed. However, it didn't stop there. This new front has spread to the Red Sea, which was already unstable because of Houthi rebel strikes on container ships. Iran-backed Houthi forces said that American ships in the Red Sea would be fair targets if the U.S. supported Israel or carried out additional operations. Companies involved in Israeli shipping have already redirected traffic away from Suez. A single rocket close to the canal could stop one of the most vital conduits of international trade. Therefore, Egyptian authorities are nevertheless on high alert. The world's oceans have recently become a new battlefield for the trade and war, which was formerly a question of tariffs and retaliatory tax schedules. Officials rushed to react in Brussels, the capital of the European Union. The European Commission summoned an emergency meeting as soon as the news of the airstrike surfaced, with safeguarding energy imports at the top of the agenda. After the invasion of Ukraine, Europe, which formerly depended largely on Russian gas, has become more and more reliant on Gulf crude. However, with Iranian ports perhaps closed and Hormuz under threat, that energy flow is now in doubt. In a heated phone discussion, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi was cautioned by French President Emmanuel Macron that further bombardment could lead to a catastrophic escalation. Embassy employees were evacuated from Thrawn by Germany. The scramble to strengthen strategic oil reserves then started throughout Europe. The response was chilly in China, but it wasn't any less significant. Iran's biggest client is China. Currently, more than 90% of Iran's oil exports flow east. The core of China's energy supply system was hit when American missiles bombed Iran's nuclear facilities. Beijing reacted quickly. State oil firms were instructed to use strategic reserves. Offloading for smaller, independent refiners that the U.S. recently sanctioned was stopped by ports along the eastern seaboard. The strike was also denounced by China's foreign ministry, which described it as a breach of international law and a danger to world peace. However, China's attention was not solely on the recent energy shock over an already existing economic conflict. This was a trade and flashpoint. A number of Chinese refiners have already been sanctioned by the U.S. for buying Iranian crude. Now that the stalemate had turned into a three-way tug-of-war, the entire diplomatic framework was being pulled into the abyss by a disintegrating nuclear accord, economic penalties against China, and a military confrontation with Iran. In an effort to distance itself from the financial institutions of the West, Beijing responded by speeding up energy cooperation, holding discussions with Russia, and covertly introducing a fresh wave of yuan-based oil deals. Please click the subscribe button to show your support for the channel before we proceed. The mood was rebellious back in Washington. Officials from the White House justified the strikes as essential. They maintained that Iran had reached an irreversible point in its nuclear development, according to intelligence officials. Iran would have enough enriched uranium for many weapons by the end of the year if no action was taken. However, truckers, importers, and refinery operators were calculating fallout as lawmakers argued doctrine. Due to tariffs and retaliatory penalties, supply chains already had to pay more for every mile that was rerouted, every insurance premium that was increased, and every oil shipment that was delayed. Customs delays were being reported by logistics companies in Chicago's ports as additional security measures were implemented as gasoline prices surged. California's irrigation systems, pumps, and almond orchards lay idle. Maintenance workers at oil rigs in Texas said that spare components that were ordered from Asia were trapped in the web of insurance suspensions and roiling mayhem in Red Sea ports. The conflict wasn't in theory. Global supply lines were being choked, one container at a time. How about the tariffs? Once dominating the news, the trafficking in guns now felt like fuel for a raging inferno. The tariff war with China has already been rekindled by President Trump's second-term trade policy. Early in June, new rounds of duties on minerals, textiles, and electronics went into force. These levies were now clashing with a new reality. However, as oil prices were rising and trade routes were in chaos, inflation was on the rise. The cost of consumer items that depend on petrochemicals or long-distance delivery was rising, and it was a straightforward question that was being raised in capitals, from Seoul to Sao Paulo. Is it possible for the world economy to withstand a Middle East conflict on top of an existing trade war? The reactions at the UN reflected the uneasiness around the globe. The Secretary General demanded that hostilities end immediately. Washington was accused by the Russian envoy of upsetting the world order. Even America's European allies carefully crafted their statements, urging moderation and reminding the U.S. that all acts must be in accordance with international law. While China's delegate criticized unilateral aggression, however, the shipping data revealed the truth amidst the diplomatic feigning. A supertanker departing the Gulf now makes an average of nearly $50,000 per day, up from $20,000 previously. It wasn't conjecture. That was the cost of the Iranian conflict. The government acted swiftly to mobilize support at home. Although footage of damaged nuclear plants was shown on state television, it was made apparent that no core systems had been destroyed. Israeli cities had already been hit by missiles, and proxy militias were organizing in Syria and Iraq. It was an obvious message. Trade through the Gulf would be slowed by fire if bombs were to slow Iran's nuclear development. Cargo planes, oil tankers, and container ships were all chess pieces in a much larger game. However, something much more deadly was starting to happen beneath the noise of explosions and speeches. A reorganization of partnerships. India, which was torn between its strategic alliances and its energy requirements, started urgent negotiations with Gulf and American suppliers. Both South Korea and Japan, which depend on Middle Eastern oil, made discrete adjustments to their contracts and increased their reserves. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and even the Gulf states themselves were in a precarious situation. Although they opposed Iran's militarism, they were equally concerned that American efforts may lead to a breakdown in the area. During a private conference with Guelph representatives of the International Atomic Energy Agency, they issued a warning that attacks on Iranian nuclear sites might have far-reaching economic, environmental, and disaster effects. The quiet in Washington got louder. Ratings organizations such as Fitch and Moody's updated their projections for economic growth in the United States. They mentioned tariffs, as well as the combined effects of trade route interruption and energy insecurity. Interest rates, inflation, and how to keep prices under control as the world's oil supply was constricting were the topics of conversation within the Federal Reserve. Voters at polling places around swing states were also observing rising gas prices, rising grocery bills, and wondering if another Middle Eastern conflict would result in security or just another recession. Once intended to demonstrate North American leadership, the Alberta G7 conference now resembles a ghost of its former coordination. Still in shock by the air attacks, European leaders gathered on the sidelines to create coordinated backup measures. Japan prepared its files with the World Trade Organization. Canada started working with the European Union to establish emergency frameworks for energy trading. There was no signed joint communication. There was not a contrived unity photo. For the first time in decades, a war that no one had requested caused the Western alliance to fall apart. But now, everyone had to find their way. Ships continued to pass through disputed areas, like Hormuz and the Red Sea, where drones circle and radar displays flicker with ghost signatures. These days, every barrel of oil contains danger in addition to energy. There is more to every cargo, container than just products. It serves as a reminder of how easy one choice, one strike, or one flash of light across a desert sky may upend the world economy. Whether the trade war will continue is not the topic at hand. Given that tariffs can be renegotiated, the question is whether global trade can continue at all while war looms. It is possible to lift sanctions. However, the loss of trust in safe travel, solid alliances, and logical diplomacy reverberates for a longer period of time than any missile. This conflict is no longer solely about ideology or uranium. The movement of products, oil, money, and power is at stake in this conflict. Furthermore, the collision will eventually be felt not only on battlefields, but also at loading docks, customs stations, dining tables, and other locations across the hold if the world is unable to avoid it.